And I'd like to call this special board meeting. Or Secretary, call the roll, please.
Directors Huang, here. Sethy,
Happily here.
Reed,
Here.
Akbari, and Gunther.
Here. Will Director Sethy happily lead us in? Sure. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States. Republic which stands one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice. You, let's see. So we'll start public comments on housekeeping.
Yeah, I can make a couple of quick housekeeping remarks just to make sure we all know how to participate. Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the ACWD Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome the public's participation in this special meeting of the ACWD Board. My name is Ed Stevenson, and I serve as the district's general manager. Members of the public may participate in this board meeting in person or remotely by either using the Zoom application or by telephone. Any member of the public participating in person may approach the speaker's podium at the appropriate time. For those participating remotely, note that the meeting agenda and all related materials are available on the district's website at acwd.org. You may reference the instructions at the top of the agenda for how to participate using the controls in the Zoom app or your dial pad if participating by telephone audio. This hybrid board meeting is being recorded and will be made available to the public for future viewing. Thank you, Mr. President. Completes my remarks.
Well, with that, then we have item 3, public comments on the matters on this notice of special meeting. Nobody online, nobody in the audience. We may proceed. Item 4.
Okay, thank you, Mr. President. Item number 4 is Water Resources Planning Workshop. This is the second in a series of workshops planned for calendar years 2024 and 2025 that'll focus on planning for long-term management of the district's water resources in the face of climate change, evolving regulations, declining availability of water supplies, new water supply alternatives, and other factors, using an integrated resources planning approach. This workshop series builds upon previous workshops conducted in 2022 and 2023. And to get us started, I will toss it over to our Director of Water Resources, Ms. Heides.
Thank you, Mr. Stevenson. We're very excited to be here tonight to share the latest and greatest on our water supply or water resources master planning tonight with the board and the public. We're going to specifically focus tonight on reviewing some of the phase 1 work that's been going on and project scoping. And throughout, there's going to be a number of discussions tonight that we're really looking forward to your input on. So to get us started and to introduce our very capable team here, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Thomas Nizer, our water supply planning manager, who's leading this effort.
Great, thank you, Laura. Are we queued up here?
I'm not sure I hear Thomas's voice on the.
How about that?
Oh, that's better.
Hi, good evening. As was introduced, we're here to review the first phase of our Water Resources Master Plan update. Background for the public. ACWD has undertaken an update to our Water Resources Master Plan. Our original plan was established in 1995. We called it the Integrated Resources Plan, or IRP. And the IRP has been an invaluable planning document for us. It established water resources goals and gave us guidance on how to direct staff and projects and funds over the past 30 years. But being 30 years and abundant change that has gone on in the ensuing time, it's time to update the plan. We want to update the plan to reflect the changes in water supplies and regulations and changing priorities of our community, which itself has changed over the past 30 years. And we also need to be prepared for the challenges of the next several decades, most notably climate change. So an updated plan will provide a framework for decision-making for staff and management to help implement the goals of the board over these coming decades. Here with us tonight are our consultant team. ACWD, after a competitive bid process, selected Woodard & Kern to work on this phase 1. Tonight with us is Persephone St. Charles, project lead. We also have Katie Cole, project manager. They'll all be up in front of you shortly. And gentlemen, probably don't need to introduce Mr. Philippe Daniel of Liquisti. Did I say it right? Okay. Known commodity here to the district. And with that, I will hand it off to Persephone.
Thank you, Thomas. Hello, directors. Hello, everyone. I'm certainly excited to be here tonight. We've been working very hard on this effort, and it's great to be able to present to you today the fruits of our labors from this phase one process. As well as to share with you how what we learned in this phase one process is going to be wrapped into our approaches of the scoping that we're doing right now. We're looking at how we're actually going to do the planning in phase two. But of course, we're going to be providing this information, but we also, being that this is a workshop, want to make sure that we're getting a lot of discussion and feedback from you all. And so while I'll be presenting the material, Philippe is going to be facilitating several discussion points along the way. I think we have 7 of them, right, Philippe? So do you want to tell him a little bit about how that's going to work?
Good evening. So I'll be clarifying and capturing any of the questions and inputs you have. And the presentation has been broken up into 7 segments. So after each segment, we'll have a couple of moments, minutes to kind of discuss and get your input. Now, for some of those things, you might be anticipating the next section. And if so, we'll record them there on the flip charts just to remind ourselves we're going to pick that up later. And by the end of the meeting, we'll make sure we've captured all those things. That said, you know, this effort really is an extension, an expression of your mission to provide a reliable supply of high quality water at a reasonable price. So the inputs that we gain from you are going to be very critical for us to understand how you get at the underlying trade-offs that are always part of making decisions. So hope to really foster a good dialogue, glean enough insight from you so we can meaningfully go forward into phase 2.
All right. So this agenda here actually outlines these different sections that we're talking about that we're going to be providing some information and looking for your input and feedback on. So we're going to give a little bit of an overview of the engagement that we did do during phase 1. And then we're going to talk about how that input was used into how we're approaching phase 2, which is the actual doing of the plan. We've broken that into a few areas. One is looking at how the input influenced what we have as water resources goals for 2050. And how it also influenced our technical approach to the scoping in some key areas, like looking at what sort of evaluation criteria we might use. What are some of the water resources options that we'll be most likely considering? And then how do we want to do the planning, which is the planning objectives? How do we want to go about this process? Then a third section is about the outreach and engagement. And that's really, we did, of course, outreach and engagement in phase 1. But what it also taught us is how we want to do continued outreach and engagement in phase 2 at a much more wider scale, more encompassing as we actually do the planning work. And so how that's also going to be facilitating us in deliberation and decision making. And then we'll close today with next steps of where we go from here. So we've talked a lot about phase 1 and phase 2 already, and this is a little roadmap to orient you of sort of where we've come from and where we're going temporarily. So on a time scale. So we've spent, part of the fall into winter sort of gathering and synthesizing input from public, from interested parties, through board workshops and other mechanisms, and also from staff as well. We're currently in the process, like I said, of preparing a phase 2 scope using that input. But as part of that process, we are here today in April of 2024 because we want to get further input on some of the approaches that we're looking at in phase two. So we're not necessarily today going to go through what the proposed scope of work is. More, we're going to focus on our approaches to it and get your input on whether we're going in the right direction with how we're approaching this phase two scope. So then after that, we'll take your input. We'll finish the scoping process and be back in front of you in May, June timeframe so that you can approve and begin phase two procurement for selecting support for that process in phase two. The goal with phase two is that we'll be able to begin work then in fall of 2024 of this year and wrap it up in 2025. So with that, I'd like to share with you a little bit about our phase one engagement process that we embarked on. So I think Thomas provided this graphic for you in March as an update. Just to reiterate, in the fall, a little more detail than what I've just described. We had input from public, interested parties, and board that really shaped a few different areas. One is we took key takeaways from that, and we have some draft water resources goals and planning objectives that we'd like to share with you today and get your input on. And it also helped us form what we're calling a communication and engagement plan for phase two. So we spent a lot of time asking questions of potential parties that might be interested or that might be involved in phase two, how best to engage with them, what sort of mechanisms, what sort of topics are going to be most useful in getting their participation in phase two, as well as who else should be involved in phase two. So we took those key takeaways and developed those. We also focused on the technical. So we wanted to get at least a good idea of what sort of evaluation criteria we should be looking at when assessing the performance of what our solutions would need to accomplish and have those align with the goals that we have established. And so it was really kind of a two-part process where we wanted to look at what could be those potential evaluation criteria that are going to be meaningful to those folks that we got input from. And then what do we already know about that we have access to so that we can build on the data and the work that's already been produced and provided. So, and then figure out through the phase two what additional sort of technical analyses we would need to do in order to adequately characterize and assess these solutions. And so that's what led us to this phase two scope of work. So the phase one engagement process and purpose. So I mentioned that we had a few different audiences we were trying to tap into. Starting, of course, with the district itself. We had regular meetings with staff. We had some board workshops, right, that we got some great input on. And we headed in knowing that the purpose of this outreach in phase one was really to understand what the priorities you have as a district are, and then also to provide direction on planning goals and objectives, and then collaborate on planning needs and methods. Similarly, we met with interested parties over the course of several meetings, focused in some of those participants were related agencies, government, environmental, regulatory interests, community advocacy, groundwater users. We really wanted to hear from these folks. What are their water planning priorities that they're doing in their organizations and the synergies that we could have in working with them collaboratively. And then also understand how best to work with them moving forward and understand any constraints and interests and participation in phase two. We also did a really great public polling in December of 2023. We had over 400 respondents. And the purpose there was we really wanted, since this was still just phase one, we really wanted to start testing the community values and priorities and really understand what's important to the communities and the folks that you serve. Again, determine their preferred outreach strategies, how best to work with them and include them in the process, and really make sure that you're understanding the demographics of the customers, both direct that get a bill from you and indirect that may pay through renting agreements. And so I wanted to share a little bit on some of the key takeaways from that public polling. I understand that you have as attached a more detailed report of what was included in the polling and some of the results. But for the purposes of today, we wanted to just focus on a few key takeaways that we thought were particularly useful in helping us do the scoping. So one of the areas is water a priority? Because we wanted to understand, where does water fit in their world? We all have a lot of competing interests and priorities in our lives. So where does water fit within that? And we found out that water is important, but it's not a top priority when you consider it against factors like public safety, drugs, crime, homelessness, housing affordability. So I think it's important for us to realize where water fits within your customers and how we need to meet them where they're at. And then if you are thinking about water, what is important about it? Certainly cost and cost trade-offs. Rates are obviously really important, but sustainability, reliability, and resiliency are also considered important aspects when they think about water resources. Again, on the participation side, how can you participate? What are you willing to contribute to this process? And it was interesting because we heard that they're mainly interested in just getting sort of updates as they go along. There wasn't a whole lot of enthusiasm for attending in-person meetings, which was informative for us on how we go about doing our communication and engagement with them. And then also we started testing a little bit about what their thoughts are on supply sources. Now we're going to get more into supply sources and all the technical aspects in phase 2, but we wanted just a little precursor to understand where they were coming from. And so we found out that there are some supply sources that may have some preconceived concerns, and that they do view conservation as a form of supply, and that it should be included when we talk about supplies as something that would take investment and that would be comparative against wet water supplies. So with that, we'll hand it over to Philippe to facilitate discussion on what I've just presented.
So the floor is open. And I guess first of all, what do these findings actually most interest you? I guess that would be a good way of starting. Is there anything here that either confirms what you thought or surprises you at all?
I would also use a different word than community priority, community concern.
Mm-hmm.
We have an adequate water supply. In over 50 years, there's only 4 months since the state water project. We've only had 4 months in which we had a concern, and that was an administrative hiccup on the part or mistake on the part of the state DWR, which cut to 0 allocations. Even with a couple of percent allocations, we could then get water from our other sources. So that was an administrative shortfall. So we have an adequate water supply. We always have had.
Right. So some of the concerns they cited had to do with the negatives of homelessness, of crime. Here, water has been delivered consistently. So a priority maybe, but not so much a concern that there is a lack of. Yes.
Yeah. And so it's not a concern. It should not, need not, and should not.
Yeah.
Second has been the policy of this district that water will not be a development constraint.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever the development requirements are, we will find the water to support it. And hopefully I don't know that we've articulated that position, but it's one that we must keep in mind.
Yes. Other observations,
So
comments?
I guess I can go next. I think the finding is pretty consistent with what I expected. I will fess up that I have not had time to actually drill down to the report yet. But I am a little bit curious. Hopefully later we could talk about the preconceived concerns regarding different water supply.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's definitely capture that. What were the preconceived notions? We'll handle that under the water supply discussion. Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
I found it interesting about conservation.
Mm-hmm.
Problem becomes is you can't conserve from 0.
Right.
And, I guess if you go back to the first one, where our priority is in their relationship, you're right, we've been here, we're gonna be here, they know that, expect it. As you don't maintain that reliability supply, conservation's not gonna do you any good down here.
Yeah. And it's interesting, as you dig into the poll findings, one of the questions had to do with would people want additional supply reliability during droughts, or would they be willing to kind of take less water? And there's some who expressed that dynamic relative to conservation. Yeah.
And they've shown that
Yes, they have.
consistently.
Yeah.
I can add one other thought that was really not into the framework of the public currently. Our design criteria, efforts, water should be based on contingencies. How do we respond to a contingency environment? Droughts are episodic, and I would call them a contingency. Water conservation is appropriate at times of a contingency. It's not a particular need at other times of the year, even though there's state legislation of conservation as a way of life. There's where water efficiency, but conservation is the actions and the lack of understanding of what water efficiency is and what conservation is. Those terms being defined. Low flush toilet is water efficient. Not flushing after every use is conservation.
So as I hear Director Weed, there's two issues. Number one is in talking about conservation, to distinguish between the water efficiency side, where we're actually just reducing the demand associated with all these different activities we normally do, as opposed to an action that can be taken in response to a stress to the system, which would be the conservation behavior.
And that should be the definition of conservation. We have broadened we use the term conservation in a much broader context, and maybe the public does the same.
So nomenclature to kind of distinguish between the water efficiency.
But as an organization, we should at
And-
least comprehend the distinction.
Thank you.
So I have a few impressions here. I was surprised in this respect that water was actually so high.
Mm-hmm.
And after you get past the first five, fifth is water or drought, transportation and traffic issues are half of the concern. That's the next nearest one.
Right. Drops from 8% went down to 3% or so. Yeah.
Yeah, and I thought education, local education, schools would be much higher. Water is more of a concern than taxes by 4 times. How surprising is that?
Yeah.
And I fully expected that healthcare would be much higher, but it's down at 1%. So the fact that water, 1 out of 12 people think it's the most important issue, or one of the top 5,
Yes.
I think is significant.
Mm-hmm.
Go back here. I think we can talk about more about water supply alternatives or additional water supply options, but I'll tell you, I was a little discouraged with the questions about desalination of ocean water, because that's never been a real thought of this district. And I thought it was a missed opportunity to talk about, help educate these 400 people in our community about the fact that we have the only brackish water desal plant in Northern California, and it is our lowest cost of water supply, providing, somewhere around 20% of our community needs.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have talked about the possibility of where in our jurisdictional geographic area, which is broader than the Tri-City community that we serve, goes up the west side of 880, all the way up past the San Mateo Bridge, to look at maybe an alternative or a secondary brackish water desal source.
So if I could,
if
if I
we
could
don't-
rephrase that, Director Sethy,
Yeah.
it's kind of like what Director Weed said with conservation, need to bifurcate desalination into the brackish and the ocean is kind of two kind of different important distinctions to make in talking about supply alternatives.
Right, and ocean water desal, like can't even imagine us doing something like that when we have other options available for the district. So again, I thought it was a little bit of a missed opportunity. But as I got deeper into the research data, and I don't know if there's going to be, I think there will be other opportunities to talk about our demographics and how our community views us. But one thing that stood out to me, and I think this is due to the district having really strong education programs in our schools from elementary through high school, is how much more aware younger people are, either by, by age group and other definitions. I have to go back into the actual questions that were asked. But I think younger people today, let's say under 40, are much more attuned to the water issues than more of our older demographic. So I think that was a positive to me. Continuing education is really important for our community. And I doubt, and I think I know this well from talking to a lot of people in our community, folks don't really have a real good idea of where our water comes from.
Mhm.
And we're getting really granular here in asking people questions where it's hard to imagine what the district has. The other thing, and although it was a much smaller proportion of the people that were asked, I think that I learned that the district needs to do a much better job communicating with people in our ethnic communities that speak different languages, Spanish, Vietnamese, other languages, Mandarin.
And what leads you to that kind of conclusion?
Well, just the data that I was looking at, it looks like they're not as well attuned to these issues.
Mhm.
So I see that as an opportunity
Yes.
for the district.
We're probably getting into later issues on your program, but not included in here was recycled water, fortunately. And unfortunately, we still have it shown in our long-term plan.
Okay, so
Desalination is far superior to recycled water, including ocean desal.
Director Weed, there's actually detailed questions on water purification from wastewater
Okay,
in here.
well, in the sense that, in the summary statements and the priorities.
Yeah.
PFAS, so under CERCLA is clearly associated with recycled water. Recycled water is a de novo generator of PFAS. We've got a real problem with that whole industry. And to the extent that we can avoid not only ourselves, but are being involved in other recycled water projects, which we're being drug into in San Ramon, SFPUC, Bosca, we should. There's a joint and several liability, which is going to be incredible. And so hopefully coming out of this project, we will eliminate all references to recycled water in our long-term planning.
we'll get into the alternatives later. One final question before we move on, and that is, in terms of your own understanding to inform your own decision-making, are there questions that were not asked or questions that you would like to drill down in more detail that would actually help you in the process of governance and making trade-offs? Is there anything that comes to mind, or you can just put a pin in that and forward it onto the team? Director Weed?
We may run into a situation because some judicial decisions to have to go to the voters to get approval for funding for major water projects. Delta conveyance, acquisition, the ways to approach imported water supplies, acquisition of watershed, things of those natures. So to the extent that we're going to need voter approval, these opinions are very critical to us.
Well, let me piggyback on those comments by saying that it wasn't clear to me that we were asking questions where we actually can make investments in things. Let's say the reoperation of Lake Del Valle. We completed a major expansion on Calaveras Reservoir with the Hetchatchee system. We're working with Los Vaqueros Reservoir right now on a major expansion. We're involved with the building of the tunnel through the Delta. These questions were not asked in the survey questions.
That is correct. Yes.
And I think those are the critical things that we're trying to evaluate and trying to evaluate the business cases, what the return on investment might be for our communities. And I think that summarizes what I.
Yeah, and we'll get into this a little bit more when we talk about evaluation criteria. The principal question there will be, are we measuring the things that actually are important to us, to you, and to your customers? Are we measuring those things so we can actually quantify those and look at how they roll up? So as opposed to asking questions about the alternatives first, we want to think about what are the items that matter to people and make sure those are captured in the evaluation criteria.
I'll throw out one more quick thought that the year's survey in great part reflects the efforts this district has done in our overall conservation outreach programs. We have a staff, we spend a fair amount of money at it, it's fairly aggressive. So one of the reasons I think we have the higher recognition among the public is directly related to the expenditures we've made in our conservation programs.
Yes. All right, at this point, I'll turn it back to Persephone and I'll note down the items we'll make sure to cover at our next several stop points.
Hello again. So that was some of the input that we got through the process, but now we want to talk about these key areas of how we used that input and fed it into sort of our approaches as at looking at phase 2, which is essentially how we're going to be doing the plan. There we go. So the first area that we want to talk a little bit about is our 2050 water resources goals. And, you know, the term goals and objectives can be very squishy depending on, you know, which planning effort you're talking about. In this case, we're defining the goals as sort of our desired outcomes for the future in water resources. What water resources future does the district want to achieve by 2050? So this is where do we all want to be? If we visualize our future, what is it going to be looking like? And what is ACWD's role in all of that? So first I want to make sure that we're in our exploration of this, that we are looking back at all the work that was done for the 1995 IRP, because that was a really successful planning process, had a lot of good goals. In this case, they were called policy objectives, is kind of the same kind of idea as what we're thinking of for goals now. And so we wanted to make sure we referenced those, revisited those as sort of a foundational way of looking at forming new goals. And so you can see here that the goals in 1995 were really kind of focused on, you know, these key 6 areas of costs and making sure that, of course, we're minimizing resource costs and how that affects customer bills and how that affects rates. The second area, of course, was reliability, wanting to make sure that there's a high level of service reliability, of course, water quality, making sure that there weren't sudden changes in water taste or appearance, and that that the health-related quality was being maximized. The environmental impacts discussion was heavily centered on making sure that whatever strategies came out of the IRP, they wouldn't create environmental impact problems, or if they did, that they could be mitigated, and that there was an idea that we wanted to protect groundwater resources. Local control was also important, right? Thinking about, we want to make sure we're creating a future that we have some control over, and that we can avoid chronic shortages. And then risk was, you know, certainly embedded in there. And there's a lot of different aspects of risk when we think of risk. And so when we get into the evaluation criteria a little bit more, we're going to talk about these different areas of risk. But for the goals, we're just recognizing that that it's there, and we want to make sure that we're minimizing those as we look into the future. So that was 1995. Here's some of the input that we received that we thought really helped us in rethinking some of these goals for 2050. First, we heard some key themes, and these themes are sort of an aggregate across all the different inputs that we had. So it's, from director workshops that we had, but also through the public polling that you've been just discussing, as well as some of the work with the interested parties. And so what we heard is that it's important to have regional perspective, right? You all have been a leader in regional planning and water resources, and that's appreciated, and it should continue to move forward. Continued regional collaboration on resources is important, and you all should be continuing your leadership in making sure that that's happening. Affordability and equity, of course, were big areas. Ensuring that water is reasonably affordable. Reasonably, of course, is a loaded word because that can mean different things to different people, depending on which audience we're talking about there. But ensuring equity of water service and quality, of course, is another big aspect of that. Resilience and sustainability, these are words that sometimes get used interchangeably, but for the purposes of the input that we got, basically long-range sustainability. So this is a long-range plan in 2050. We want to make sure that we're focused on having long-range sustainability in the face of climate change, so that we're considering climate change in that sustainability. And that we have resilient systems that leverage existing infrastructure. Yeah,
Can
go
I
ahead.
Make a quick comment here.
Mhm.
If you go back to your last slide, and I hope you don't mind me interrupting while I'm
Not at all.
thinking, have the thought in my head. So when I was reviewing this and I was looking at reliability from the 95 IRP,
Mhm.
it's talking about service reliability. Having grown up in this community, I'm thinking about delivery to the home that I grew up in,
Mhm.
or present home, and making sure people get water when they want it.
Mhm.
I think today, the way I look at it is we want reliability in our water supply sources. That's why Delta Conveyance is so important, or having an emergency water supply at Los Vaqueros Reservoir. Then under local control, and I didn't see that feeding into your next two slides.
Okay.
The reliability on water supply sources. So I want to
Right.
make sure to get that ticked down.
Right.
And then when it came to local control, we were, I believe, 8 years away from operation of our desal plant, which was then doubled in capacity in 2010. And so avoiding chronic shortages, which was a concern going back to like the 1970s drought, I don't think really became an issue after that. Even when we went down to zero allocation from the state during this drought, last drought, but the one before, 2015, we were still able to meet the needs of the community,
Mhm.
through conservation and other things. So I just wanted to register those two bullets.
Great. Noted.
I'd like to add on that. I
Okay.
don't want to slow us down too much, but one of the questions that was asked was securing additional water supplies. Perhaps we should ask a question along these lines of shoring up existing water supplies that versus additional water supplies is shore up what we already have right now.
So you're getting into our goals, right? So
Okay.
let's jump to that slide, because that's where this articulation of what does all of this mean and how do we feed it into words that are meaningful, right? And so the goals that we put in is coming up shortly. And I think that that would be a good topic of conversation. Just one more point on this slide is some of the input that we received is that, you know, when we embark on this and we think about, you know, water master plan for 2050, the focus is obviously heavily on supply. But what we also heard is that, you know, when we think of water resources and certainly the district's role in all of that, it goes even more beyond supply, right? There's a few areas here that we heard through all three groups, which is there's a role for environmental and watershed stewardship that's coupled with, you know, looking at how we're being stewards of the watershed. And I think maybe more than in 1995 being a little more proactive instead of avoiding impacts, but what can we do to contribute to enhancing the watershed from an environmental perspective? Energy use, this came up for certainly O&M. The more energy used, the more expensive it is. So there's a cost element too, but there was also a greenhouse gas element too of concerns over energy and contributions towards climate change in the form of greenhouse gas emissions. And then additionally looking at, you know, we can come up with all the greatest ideas in the world, but if we don't have a pathway to implement those, and it's not feasible to actually get done in the real world, then it doesn't do us much good. So there was a lot of focus on making sure that we focus on the implementation and how these ideas are going to be implemented. And so those manifested into an attempt by our team to sort of characterize, you know, what are some of these goals then? If we think about as we're embarking on this planning exercise, what's the future we're trying to get towards? And so what do we need to create solutions to try to get us there? And so the first one is sustainable water supply portfolio that leverages, and here's where your comment, Director Gunther, maybe there's, you know, we want to think about this wording, local resources and adapts to climate change. The second one is focusing on affordable and equitable supply for all direct and indirect customers. And I think, you know, the focus on direct and indirect was something that also came out really clear. Direct being those that get a water bill directly, and indirect being those that are paying for that water bill as part of rent. And so, so affordable and equitable supply, resilient and optimized water service, infrastructure system and operations. So it's resilient, meaning it can bounce back from interruptions or emergencies, but that it's also optimized and it's running efficiently and effectively. And then healthy watersheds and aquifers. So above ground and below ground that are managed to provide multiple benefits, right? So there's win-wins as you're doing thing 5, which is collaborative leadership to facilitate regional water management across sectors and across the geography. So based on the input that we heard through workshops with you all, the public survey, interested parties, these are sort of the water resources goals that the core team had kind of come up with as a way to sort of guide us. And I know you probably have some thoughts on those. And so you can ask questions of me, or we can go right into the facilitated discussion, which is what Philippe is going to be leading. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them, or we can get your comments and thoughts through Philippe.
No. Introduce some concepts on where we've been before we go to where we're going. I would argue that our rate structure does not reflect our cost. We have not matched variable cost to variable income and fixed cost to fixed income. Therefore, has reflected in the need for drought surcharges and other fundamental dysfunctional rates. The need for thousands or tens of thousands of delinquency bills, referrals to collection agencies by not using the property tax to its potential, which would get the bills paid in full and by the property owners. On a water supply side, incredible failure to purchase the watershed with the N3 Ranch was one of the greatest failures of governance in the history of this area. 3-2 vote. The ability to acquire control of Del Valle Reservoir for another 50,000 acre feet of storage that's built, plumbed, and paid for. And we dropped the ball on that. And we need to continue to pursue it, but we're not getting cooperation from our fellow agencies. We have extraordinary vulnerabilities with the groundwater supply at semi-tropic in particular, which we may lose shortly and terminates within another 10 years or so, with no identified follow-on. So we to date, we have a mixed bag of success. We've had some good fortune in many areas, but with sea level rise, the threat to the delta, a number of issues coming down the pike that are going to be expensive. But I would suggest that our performance has not been particularly outstanding.
Actually, if you don't mind, I just want to note that I think we have at least one bona fide member of the public who's online. So as we take these opportunities to seek input, we're certainly looking for input from the board. It's also a good opportunity too, just as a reminder to our public. This is a great opportunity for you also to provide any input you have on what you're seeing here. Simply raise your hand and we'll make sure that you have an opportunity to provide input as well.
So I guess a question to these goals that are listed here are these goals sufficiently encompassing?
So I guess I'll start. I have a couple questions, one question and a thought. So are these goals co-equal or are they in order of importance?
Neither, I believe, is the answer. Is that correct?
Okay, so they're just there. Okay. Okay, that's fine. So I do have a little bit concern on number 2, affordable and equitable supply for all direct and indirect customers. In terms of affordable, we have no control over the indirect customers, how much they pay, right? Literally is how much the landlord is going to charge them. So that's going to be a little bit difficult if that's our goal when we don't have control over. So that's the concern I have.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And yes, it does capture what's important to me.
Good, thank you. Others, are these goals sufficiently encompassing?
So
What you're
again, on number 3, to me, it sounds like a reiteration of our 95 IRP. Because it sounds like it is the local service area in infrastructure. And I would like us to think more broadly about infrastructure. We have to make investments in the South Bay Aqueduct. We'd like to see a Delta conveyance system, some permanence. We have a ethane transfer pipeline that we want to build down from Los Vaqueros Reservoir as a direct feed into the South Bay Aqueduct. That is more regional, Northern California type projects. Reoperation of Lake Del Valle, it's an investment that would have to be made.
Your major point being that resiliency has to do with the whole system, from all these imported sources, the supplies and the associated infrastructure to get them inside the district boundary, as well as the infrastructure within the district to deliver to your former house and your existing house.
That's very well said. It's going back to the sources of water and the delivery into our service area as separate from the distribution of that water within our own infrastructure that we own.
Right, so embodying the source of tap, I might also add that I noted this question of make sure that we're not only looking at new supplies, but are assessing the reliability of our existing supplies and the opportunities for improving that reliability of existing supplies.
Yeah, and I will add that I'm not naive to think that we are the final decision makers and arbiters on the future operation of this district. There's going to be other people that replace us in the future that will use this document, this new document, as a guidepost, just like we've used the 1995 document. And so we need to think about the issues that boards and management teams will be trying to deal with a decade, 2 decades from now.
Right, and I think that goes to a point that Director Weed was making about the different scenarios that could cause these outages, both present and future.
Okay. My comment on this slide would be number 5. Been very disappointed in the lack of collaborative efforts on the part of our, particularly the South Bay ACWD contractors and Valley Water and Zone 7. And there is an opportunity for us to take leadership, even individually, in regional water supply management. We're at the hub. We could become a supplier to a regional supplier of water as an enterprise effort by bringing in water and then distributing it throughout the region. And to that extent, it'd be nice to have them on board. It'd be nice to have the Joint Power Authority, which acquired the watershed of the Alameda Creek, to acquire lands and water banks in the San Joaquin Valley, but much like Irvine Ranch, where you own the property and therefore you have basic control and authority over it. They have ownership of the South Bay Aqueduct, as well as control and ownership of the Del Valle Reservoir. That we have the money to do it. Unfortunately, we don't. We have some weak partners, and maybe we can over time work for that. But we need not hold ourselves back from exercising leadership, given our geopolitical position in the water map and atlas.
And so what I hear you articulating is that collaborative leadership is important to you, and you want the district to step into that more fully. So as we talk about alternatives, about alternative supplies, it's also kind of the question of what would enable those alternatives to be more fully operational.
Well, I think we could do the leadership on our own. It would be nice to, then with the exercising that leadership, I think we'd find the collaboration.
Yes. Thank you. Any other comments on these goals? Is anything missing at all from these goals?
I like the goals. I like number 3. I'm with Director Sethy on number 3. There's 2 infrastructures. There's our local, and we're spending, or we're planning on spending, a very large amount of money to shore up that major structure that'll get it to here. And I don't know if the public fully understands what we're really trying to do there. There's still a misconception that, we're trying to send water down to Los Angeles versus our participation is, hey, we need it here. We have to be careful, this is my opinion now. There's been a lot of mentioning of Lake Del Valle. And question then should be raised, if we're going to continue along that route, is would we like to see the park at Lake Del Valle removed? So I'm just saying that or affected by, let's say, something like where we are. And this is not about Lake Del Valle tonight. I have to be careful, but it has been raised. And so we have to be really careful on that. Some of these measures that, how do I put it? The majority of the public would not agree with if they knew exactly what the wording was. I don't know if that says.
I actually have a clarification question. So these are just goals, right?
These are just goals. We're going to get into alternatives and we're going to get into evaluation criteria.
Okay, so I will hold my questions because we kind of been spinning into the details. I just want to know where we are and.
Right.
Okay.
And I do think that President Gunther, your point about alternatives not simply being these discrete things, but associated with other ownership purchase items that enable those alternatives to be actualized. And then you're also getting to an evaluation criteria in terms of public acceptance and support.
I would also note that when we talk about state water projects, we're a 1% player. Hard to be a leader when you can be a participant and active contributing participant. But when you're 1% of the equation, it's hard to be a leader.
All right. Well, I think with that, unless there are no more comments, we'll head on to the next topic, evaluation criteria.
All right, we're doing well. We're almost an hour in. Let's see here. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit more and get into some of these technical areas a little bit more. The first area we're going to talk, as Philippe indicated, about evaluation criteria. So I'm going to give an overview on some of the input we got that really influenced sort of our technical approach. And then three key areas is that we want to talk with you today about is sort of our draft evaluation criteria, what we heard as water resources options. And I just want to start by saying there's no need for us to debate whether they're good or bad tonight, because I know that you all have different opinions on that. I think the point we want to try to just say is that we're going to be comprehensive and we're going to look at everything. We don't need to decide. That's what phase 2 is we're going to use these evaluation criteria to decide, whether these are good ideas or bad ideas. And so what we want buy-off on tonight is, are these the right things we should be looking at to make the decision of whether these are good ideas or bad ideas? Just a little bit of an overview of some of the things that we heard, because we figured you all would be curious to know what sort of supply options were brought up, as well as strategies. And then how we're going to actually go about conducting the planning and how we're going to use these things and sort of our technical approach to the planning. So here we're starting with the evaluation criteria. These were some key evaluation criteria for 1995's IRP. You can see that there was, again, here a focus on environmental issues, and it's very much about avoiding and mitigating any sort of issues related to acquiring water supply or running those facilities. As you pointed out, right, it was a different time and place, and there were some concerns about the district having control and maximizing local control of existing and future resources. Even though it's a different time and place, it's probably, we heard that that's still similar in a desire. And I think some of the things that a lot of the directors have been focused on is different areas of risk. So when you talked a little bit about the understanding the risks of the supplies, that it's not just the local infrastructure, it's also the regional conveyance infrastructure that's bringing those supplies. There's risks all embedded. So it can be, and that usually when we're thinking about the availability, we're tying that regional structure to the availability of not only is the water drops there, but what is the infrastructure, the conveyance infrastructure that needs to be there to bring it, and how reliable do we think that is? So that's usually when we're talking about sort of this availability and the risk there. And then financial risk, right? Understanding what the potential is there. And then of course, understanding changes to water quality regulations in the future, and knowing that there might be some risk in the future there. So this was, pretty good. A lot of this still applies today. Here's what we heard specifically today in our conversations through phase 1. First of all, that there should be a breadth of solutions considered. And I think this is where one of the questions we sort of were getting at is, should we kind of already be screened down into some options that we look at when we're embarking on this planning effort? Or should we make sure that everybody's thought on what should be a viable option be included, so that whether it happens or it doesn't come out in the final solution or the preferred alternative, at least everyone knows it was included, and there's some sort of an analysis as to why it didn't move forward or why it did move forward. So everyone feels like it's justifiable. So I think there is general consensus, like, let's include everything. So we want to explore everything and put it in an apples to apples situation. But in addition to those ideas that generate a unit or a volume of supply, because of the other goals that we have, we also wanted to use this as an opportunity to consider policies and operational strategies that in doing them, it may not actually generate a volume of supply, but they're needed as a companion to meet some of these other goals of how we go about doing things. Of course, risk and uncertainty was huge, as it was in 1995. And I think there was definitely more interest in really making sure that we articulate all the different forms of risk clearly. And so when we talk about the evaluation criteria, that's one of the things that we want to make sure we're covering all the risks that are potentially out there. And that that gets incorporated into how decisions are being made. When we come back to you with recommendations on preferred alternatives or portfolios that you feel like you have a good assessment of the risks associated with them, so you can make decisions based on that. And then that lends itself to justifiable outcomes. So instead of just saying, hey, these are the alternatives and they got this kind of score, I think there was a lot about looking at what are we giving up, right? It's with all the different evaluation criteria that we have, let's look at them relative to each other and say, what are the trade-offs that we may need to, if we know that something is going to be more expensive, maybe that's okay because we're trading cost for something that we want to do. So it's really kind of making sure that we create a planning process that establishes those relationships to support decision-making. And then at the end, whatever the outcome is, that it's clearly represented and it's very clear what needs to be done and why in order to make it happen. And along those lines, there's a definite interest in having an adaptive management approach in this planning process, making sure that we're looking at contingencies to facilitate some near term, that may be some tough decisions in the near term. 2050 is not that far away. So some decisions are definitely not going to need to be made through this process. And so, you know, how can we create a process that thinks about those contingencies from a way to facilitate you all having to make those decisions? But there are some decisions that could be set aside for a later date. And it's important to identify those and understand the drivers for those so that we can put a timestamp and a driver so that you know you've got to come back and make these decisions maybe when more information is known, as they don't necessarily need to be made today. And then, of course, a dynamic and adaptive implementation planning process. That means that you don't have to wait every 5 years to engage in this discussion. You can do it as you go along, year in, year out. All right, so what we have here are basically a list of, I think there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 of them, 9. You're up here. But these are the evaluation criteria that we're using to assess what these different portfolios are going to be, what our different solution portfolios are going to be. We're going to use these criteria to assess how well we're meeting the goals that we just described. So in here, we have reliability, and it's being defined here as long-term. So this is more on the aspect of availability of supplies under future drought conditions. And it implies future drought conditions considering climate change. And I think to your point, Director Sethy, I think this is where we can make sure that we include that regional infrastructure element into this analysis. So it's not just about what drops of water are there, but how are we feeling about the reliability of the conveyance in getting there? Cost efficiency. So this would be a unit cost analysis, but also on looking at, are these solutions, how fundable do we think these solutions would be to offset some of the costs that the district may incur by the nature of the type of portfolio it might be? And here's another area of risk is the regulatory impact. So this is looking at level of support and ease of permitting, giving assumed future regulations. So that's an area of risk, and it's called regulatory impact here. We're focusing on drinking water equity by looking at equitable distribution of supply qualities. So this is where there may be, we're certainly not talking about primary, right? We are assuming any of the solutions that we come up with are going to meet primary MCL considerations. We're not going to put forward any solutions that don't do that. I think this gets more into the secondary or the aesthetics issues of how that water is distributed and some variance depending on where the source is, on perceptions of the quality of that water to the end user. And so making sure that there's equitable distribution of those supply qualities across the district and that it's not localized in certain areas. Environmental stewardship. This, some of the metrics and areas that we're looking at is impact of sustainability and balance of groundwater, surface water, and ecology. And I think you all should have an attachment to this that maybe has a little bit more of a deep dive on the evaluation criteria, and it probably has some of the metrics that we could use to measure effectiveness here as an attachment to your packet. But these are just sort of the basic definitions. Local control. right? This is familiar. We don't need to explain what that is. Regional leadership, which can sometimes be an opposite of local control, depending on how you look at it, of how much, how many projects and ideas are you going to have forward that, you know, rely on coordination with others and regional collaboration versus local control. But also what all will these projects and ideas contribute to the benefit of regional needs as well as needs within the district? Leveraging of resources. So this, when we think of resources, we're thinking of infrastructure, but also staff time and underutilized local supplies. Like, is there a way to leverage all of those types of resources? Community benefits. Can we look at opportunities in doing some of these solutions where we can add in elements that provide benefits to the communities you serve beyond water supply? And then finally, adaptability and scalability, so that in an uncertain future that you have the ability for looking at phasing of supply levels to meet different demand changes and a diversification of supplies given interruptions to any one supply. So those are the list that we are proposing for consideration. The one thing I did want to point out is there's a couple things that we had in the priorities that you're not seeing in here, and there's reasons why. First of all, emergency and short-term resilience risk. So this is a lot about the local infrastructure. And the reason why this isn't necessarily, it's important and it's in one of the goals, but it's not necessarily going to be covered through this planning effort because it's really sort of the purview of water infrastructure master planning and engineer reports, where this is a long-range 2050 report. So we wanted to make sure it was covered somewhere if it wasn't going to be covered here. Similarly, I think the point was raised on affordability. That's really the purview of looking at rates and pricing analysis. That's not something we're necessarily proposing to do in this effort, but it should be done in another as a companion to this process. Drinking water quality, I mentioned, we know that all the portfolios are going to meet primary quality regulations. So it's really about the equity of distribution of some of the aesthetic elements and differences there and the sources. And then environmental water quality is really sort of the purview of environmental stormwater planning. But also, you know, it is kind of a part of when we look at sort of the environmental stewardship part, but it's not explicitly put as a criterion. All right. So with that, I'll turn it over to Philippe.
And while Philippe is coming up, I just want to note that we did have another member of the public join. So member of the public that joined, you hadn't heard about our housekeeping remarks. Please, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to raise your hand in the Zoom app.
So let's just start in with these evaluation criteria. Are the goals, are these criteria, are these the ones that you need, that we need to support sound decision-making?
Why don't I kick things off this time? So I just have one contributing thought here. So it's not lost. That's under environmental stewardship. At the time the 95 plan was written, that was just the very beginnings of our efforts with Alameda Creek Alliance and a whole network of other NGOs to try and help restore the fishery habitat in Alameda Creek. And by local control, I think those earlier boards wanted to ensure that this district provided some leadership on environmental stewardship for the fishery habitat in the watershed so that we could maintain local control over what represents 40% of our water supply. So, and this is my personal opinion. I've expressed this before. I don't view that our environmental stewardship ended when we got the fish ladders completed. There's a difference of opinion among board members. But I believe that long-term, thinking out to 2050, that the restoration of our fishery habitat needs to be understood, thought of as strongly linked to maintaining that local control on our water supply, because we were at risk of losing water if we did not take a leadership position. took 25 years to get done. But I think it was a great investment on the part of our community through their water bills, help support them.
I guess another way of stating that is that in achieving this single objective, you're actually achieving other objectives as well. And I guess it's important to kind of capture what is it that should be measured as we think about other aspects of environmental stewardship? Do we have the right parameters for capturing some of those things that you see in retrospect was the benefit of the Alameda Creek?
Yeah,
Restoration.
to put a final point on it, I believe that writing a plan out to 2050, we have to describe what we think our responsibilities are into the future in terms of supporting the investment we've already made, but future investments we're probably going to have to make as well to help restore fishery habitat.
So maybe by analogy that you have not only a capital investment, but you have kind of the ongoing O&M investment to maintain what you have.
Yes.
Well, I have a flip view on that. I view it as environmental risk.
Mhm.
We spent $100 million and put a major environmental program in upfront so that we could get on and start doing the rest of our projects, maintain the water supply to our customers. This was done as a result of some legal actions. We should be looking to get out of open channels. Vallecita's channel should be in a pipe. We should be getting out of Alameda Creek and using the Niles Canyon Aqueduct, restore it to bring the water down in a pipe so you only turn valves when you import through water from the South Bay Aqueduct. So you avoid environmental issues without having to play the continuing game and no win. They'll never achieve the goal. Fishery habitat, the great majority of the watershed is too warm to support the fish we're trying to help. And that area is going to only increase. It's a effort and futility. It's like trying to save the Delta. The Delta is doomed. The reason we have to do a bypass on the Delta is going to be an inland salton sea. And we recognize that there's some things you're not going to win in the long term, so you have to find a way to mitigate and ideally avoid the risk by not getting involved in environmentally sensitive areas.
Director Weed, if I might kind of rephrase that in terms of evaluation criteria, we should be assessing the alternatives one dimension with respect to what risk do we incur ongoing responsibility risk by certain
Cost
alternatives.
and involvement, and you can't put a cost on it because the environment's priceless. So you're in a no-win situation when you're trying to develop a water plan and a economically responsible program to provide water supply to the public in our community.
Okay, thank you.
I'm glad you include ecology. I'm probably more aligned with Director Sethy on that. But my only comment on this is that these criteria works for me, but they are subject to interpretation. So I am pretty much interpreting them as how I would like it. That's why I think it covers all my needs. But it's kind of hard to use the evaluation criteria that is so general. I think you are hearing it just from Director Wee and Director Sethy. We all interpret these criteria to say something slightly different. So how are you going to use this?
Well, I do think that's an excellent point, which it goes to the specificity of how these evaluation criteria are embodied. So you can capture both the benefits, the potential benefits, because a lot of these are forecast, as well as the liabilities, it's forecast. Do we have sufficient metrics that you're looking at the scorecard and you can see them? To your earlier question, are these in rank order? Are they equal weight? That's actually, once we get down to the analysis, we can identify where the trade-offs are. And there'd be trade-offs that have high quality of information around them, and there'd be trade-offs with significant uncertainty. And that's why you're in the position of governance to make the value judgments associated with those trade-offs.
All right, we're just going to punt the hard discussion later down the road. I got it.
But in order to have that hard discussion, we need to have the information so you
Right.
can have the hard discussion.
All right. I can live with that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, I think I'm along with Director Sethy on this one too. I feel strongly that the environmental situation is very important. We don't know where it's going. And we also need to bring in climate change, however, on that, and sea level rise, whatever the cause. It's not, the cause is a non-issue. The factor of what's going to happen is the issue.
Mhm.
And I think we've been fairly proactive with that. I disagree with the term salt and sea fairly strongly. But that's not for the discussion this evening. But still, climate change is a factor. And I think we realize that for 25 years out, we really need to start looking at that, have it identified in our plan, not necessarily for us, but for the follow-ons, because that's when it's going to kick in. Yeah, we're getting weather extremes. One could argue that. If you go back far enough, you'd probably find these weather extremes previously in history. Are they related to climate change? Maybe, maybe not. We need to be resilient to that as well. Because maybe if they're not part of climate change, well, they do happen. And droughts in California have happened, big droughts. What reason? I don't know. Krakatoa, maybe? I don't know. But that's something I think we need to be in there, is that how do we react to something? And we have all varying degrees of what the level of level of seawater rise may be, but we're a coastal community.
Mhm.
And whether we like it or not, we're on the bay. And so it is going to affect us. And we have to be responsible looking forward for that out 25 years. And how do we address that? I don't have a good answer. I just know it has to be in the equation.
So as part of the evaluation, we need to actually bracket the scenarios by which we're going to be stress testing these portfolios to see how they perform under a range of hydrologic conditions, temperatures, and just understand their performance. Then assessing what is the likely future we have for 2050 plan is again a judgment that'll be arrived at collectively, but at least the analysis will have bracketed a variety of different scenarios, both to the environmental stewardship question as well as the environmental risk.
A underlying aspect of this is financial adequacy. This district is well financed, and that is something that we need to maintain. You have a 9-to-1 funded ratio, income to debt. That's not a bad position to be in. We're going to be covering our OPEB costs by 2032, and hopefully before, with more than 100% funding. So having that financial strength, we don't want necessarily a AAA because that's too risk adverse, but at least a high sound bond rating.
And that aspect of the financial adequacy, as you stated, is one of the many dimensions that goes into this affordability question. Because to some degree, it's going to really rest with you in terms of some of the decisions on affordability and as much as that translates into rates. So again, this is the information that we'll collect on the actual costs, the financing, the impacts. There's going to be a policy judgment also with respect to affordability.
It doesn't guarantee success. We had the funding to write a check for the water, 90% of for 50,000 acres of water, which 90% was in the watershed within 3. We didn't do it, but we had the funding to do it if we wanted to.
Mhm. Yes.
May I ask a process check question? So we had a lot of market research information that was provided as supplemental material. this evening, are we just running through this presentation that you're working through? Or are
Yes.
we going to go through a second presentation on all the data that was provided?
So that's a
Because
good question. Let me just,
I'm hoping we will not.
so I don't think we're going to talk about the polling data. It's in your package, whether or not you have a separate item at a future date. Let me look to Mr. Thomas Nizer.
It's a good question. We opted to provide the full data package so that the board could have access to the survey that was put out and the balance of information, including demographics. But the purpose of tonight is really to distill it down to the salient points that are needed for establishment of goals and objectives and the scoping of phase two. And that's what the project team here has done. So we weren't planning to dig into those results by any measure.
Okay, good. I did spend a considerable amount of time going through it. I've written down some notes. Maybe I can pass them along, but I was hoping we wouldn't spend another exhaustive period of time going through that.
Likewise. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sure you got some value out of your efforts, though.
All right.
And we'll note that your question and the parking lot and demographics will be saved for another day. All right, is there anything else here on evaluation criteria? Should we continue on with the next chunk? Let's proceed.
So the next section, hopefully will go fast, although we're sort of opening up Pandora's box by talking about it. And we've already started talking about it today, but I'm going to do it anyway. So this is input, no order of importance, no judgment on whether these are good ideas or bad ideas. This is just literally through our outreach. We thought you all might be curious to hear what are some of the water supply options that came up. In the spirit of being comprehensive, this is our starter list for heading into phase two of understanding the types of things we're going to need to look at. It helps us in understanding sort of the technical breadth that we're going to have to do. And that's how we're using this list right now. We're not using it in any other way to say that we're going to be doing anything specific with each of these, just understanding the breadth of the types of supply options and strategies that we're going to need to be able to have capacity to explore in phase two. So I'm not even going to list them off. It's just the list. I did want to, though, focus on, because I think all of you are probably pretty familiar with the water supply options that are in the list. But some of the water resource strategies you might find are interesting, because this is sort of in the other hat of things that aren't necessarily generating water that came up that are the types of things that are policies or operational ideas that we could embed into the document as, you know, some of the things that we'd need to do in order to implement some of these supply projects, or we can also embed them as pieces of the portfolio. Once we get a better sense of these in phase two, we can decide best how to incorporate them. But things like operational enhancements and land use agency partnerships, supply agency partnerships, watershed enhancements. Education was brought up already, and we're going to talk about, that's going to be a component that we want to talk about in our last module for today, which is our communication and engagement strategy moving into phase two. Certainly rates, affordability, funding policies, anything that we can do, management policies, storage policies, mitigation, banking ideas. Having these discussions while we're talking about these water supply options, we're hoping to include those as part of our scoping so that it can provide some guidance and have some good discussions of creating sort of the platforms and the frameworks that you'll need to be able to help facilitate decision-making about these, but also on the implementation side and allowing you to have some of those conversations that aren't necessarily would end up in a CIP situation. So, so I just wanted to call those out, and I'll let, I think the main questions, right, Philippe, that you're going to ask is, are we missing anything? But I just want to point out before we do, we're going to have lots of time to talk about each of these options when we're going to come back to you and talk about the options specifically. Here's our list of options. Here's how we've characterized them. We're going to come back to you during phase two so you can provide lots of detailed discussion about them. At this point, it's just a list. So go back one.
And you had promised to say when
Oh,
the
right.
polling was done, what were the concerns?
Yes, I did. Thank you, facilitator. Yes, Director Huang, I'm coming back to that. So I think some of and when we say preconceived, it doesn't necessarily mean bad or good. It's just there were some definite ideas about certain supplies, in particular with regards to desal and recycled water. The main thought about desal was immediately that it's just expensive, right? And I don't think, to previous points, that there's a differentiation in public's mind of demin and ocean desal, right? That's a nuance. It's a technical nuance, and there's big differences in price. And of course, understanding what we mean when we're talking about desal and its demin versus desal and ocean desal. And so education, to that point, there was a comment made about the need, a missed opportunity of the polling to educate. I think that's one of the things that we're really wanting to focus on in phase 2, is using it as an opportunity to provide education. Because when we did the polling, there was no sort of education about these things. It was really understanding what were sort of some of the preconceived ideas. And then on the recycled water side, just a lot of concerns, with contamination and water quality with regards to that, because of, a lot of coverage right now about all of those constituents of emerging concerns. So it's not, it wasn't unexpected to see that, but it was good to see that it was good for us to know what some of those preconceived ideas are. So those are just a couple examples.
I had a couple of thoughts to offer here, if I may. First of all, under reservoirs, I think we're forgetting that 20% of our water, sometimes more, comes from the Hetch Hetchy water system. And so we are investors in the continuing operation, maintenance, rehabilitation of the entire system. We've just gone through like $5 or $6 billion of improvements on the Hetch Hetchy system, of which we're responsible for 4%. And so I don't think we can lose sight of maintaining a critical water supply line up to the Sierras, right? So I would include the Hetch Hetchy reservoirs here. Both Director Weed and I don't know where Walnut Creek Water Treatment Plant pre-treatment came from. Maybe that's a staff idea. And I'm not sure I understand where Antelope Valley came up in our discussions under groundwater banking.
I guess 2 quick points. I think the Antelope is just another groundwater banking option as a future option. But to your Hetch Hetchy SFPUC comment, I think it goes to an earlier comment, which goes to say, for our existing supplies, what is the level of reliability? What is our forecast reliability up or down? And if there is any down, is there any possibility of improving? So I think that's embedded. We need the baseline of our existing supplies and what the forecast is for those.
Okay. I agree with the Walnut Creek. East Bay Mud has a filtration plant, large filtration plant, because of interbasin transfers. But unless we're talking about getting intertied with East Bay Mud, that's interesting. Some of these things are cost factors, like the Trail of Tears. We've avoided it, but we'll see if we want to. It's been in discussion. I do believe water transfers is something to look into, which is beyond groundwater banking. Because there's some surface water transfers that are out there, Yuba, Oakdale and other places, American River. And how to deal with anything involved at all with PFAS and sewage now, I think has sort of become a tar baby that under circular that is best avoided at all cost. Because you don't know where that's going. If it's joint severally liable, you don't even want to be near it. Those are the key. San Francisco system is a number of reservoirs, and they are dealing with the unimpaired flows on the San Joaquin and looking at spending another $5-6 billion in response to that, including in getting involved in Las Vaqueras Reservoir, raising Calaveras, And yet they still have 5 to 6 years of water storage and reservoirs in the Bay Area. So a cooperative agreement there could easily administratively solve a lot of problems without having to go to cost. Thank you.
If I may, I'd like to add one other point here. I would, where you have ocean desalinization, you'd make me real happy if you put in / brackish water desal.
So just by point, you see the groundwater desalination listed up there, the Newark facility and any new sources. So I think that goes to your point of making sure we talk about both ocean and brackish
Yeah,
desal.
so let me emphasize the regional aspect here. If we did put in a secondary, first it has to be technically possible, but if we did put in a second desal plant up by the San Mateo Bridge where we have a power plant, well, that could be a regional effort that involves other water districts. Mr. Stevenson participates in a Bay Area water general managers type effort where there's been talk about putting in a supersized desal plant in Sassoon Bay that become like 100 MGD. That becomes a new water source for the Bay Area water community, or say Bay Area regionally. Those things I think should be in our thought process.
Absolutely.
Paul just touched on it. The brackish surface water, the Delta, the BAR program, the Bay Area Regional Reliability Program, identified the estuary as being the primary option for water supply if we were going to go into desalination.
Yeah, and staff is actively monitoring that as well as the Bay Area Regional Desalination Project that has looked at these multiple locations and is going through another iteration.
And that was Antioch, yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
here's the opportunity
Yes.
for leadership on the part of our district to propose a JPA that starts to pull this stuff together.
So I guess I have the same question about the nexus between the Walnut Creek Water Treatment Plant pretreatment with
Can
water
you,
supply. The Walnut Creek Water Treatment Plant pretreatment, I was wondering about how that become a water supply options. I was digging around on the internet. Maybe I can see it. But I'm curious to see how that, why was that included? I assume that show up probably through staff polling.
I think it came from staff as also, I think,
Yeah.
part of the BAR, Bay Area Regional
Okay, the bar
Reliability
project,
Program.
okay. Okay. And the second question is underwater resource strategies. How does mitigation banking become a water resource strategy?
Stephanie? Want to come up to the microphone?
I think this is just an opportunity to have a discussion of whether you want to embark on that. I don't think it's necessarily, again, that it's about just considering, I think, all the goals that are there that you have, they go beyond sort of just, very supply focused. So I think it's just an opportunity for you all, since it's come up in the past, to use this as a mechanism by which you can, decide whether you want to explore those opportunities or not. I'm not sure, to be honest, the history as much about it. I think it just kind of came up as something that maybe we could use this as an opportunity to do that, to have those discussions.
Okay, I guess this probably, maybe I can see it in terms of not getting us the wet water in terms of water resources, but perhaps it could impact our ability to get that drop of water, maybe? Okay, I will keep an open mind.
Yeah, I mean, these are all just, right? It's like
Okay.
potpourri of ideas,
Yeah,
right?
there's, at this point, I'm not going to pass judgment as in, is it good or bad, but does this whole bucket includes things I want to see? And if that's
Yes.
what you're asking, then the answer is yes.
I'm
Okay.
open-minded too.
Any other comments before we move on to the next?
One other comment, because you did bring it up earlier from the survey data, that our community thinks that conservation is an additional source of water, part of our water supply portfolio. So that's not on the water supply options here, but I think you might want to put conservation down there, you know, like turf replacement, stuff like that.
Noted. Well, shall we move on to the next item or?
Go
Yeah,
ahead, move on.
Okay.
I'm thinking about something that,
We can all circle back.
Right, I'm just doing a time check. We're at 5:36, so we've got a couple areas left to go, so. Let's see. All right, so now we're gonna be talking a little bit about planning objectives. And again, just a point on definition, we've talked about water resources goals. These planning objectives are not a subset of the goals. They're completely different lists of things. So the water resources goals are really focused on what's the future we want to have in 2050 when we think about our water resources. This is really about through this planning process that we're engaged in this water resource master planning 2050. You know, how do we want to conduct this planning? What do we want to try to accomplish by going through this planning process? So similarly, these are some of the planning objectives that you had in 1995. And so we started with this list, but this is an area where we did get a lot of the input from all three groups that we talked with, that we're able to apply a lot of what we heard as to how we're going to actually be doing the planning. And so I'm going to jump to those. So we came up with sort of 8 areas that we wanted to make sure that whatever the phase 2 scope has, that it will allow us to do these things through the planning effort. One is that we're making sure that we're examining this comprehensive list. So we've allowed for that of all potential supply projects, including these strategies, and that we have a process in it by which we can select and support you all in selecting a justifiable portfolio that will best meet the water resources goals, so that we're tying it back to the goals at the end. Another key aspect is that we have methodologies in place in our scope where we're addressing future uncertainty and risk, and that we're dedicating good amount of analysis towards understanding what that uncertainty is and putting them in the contingency and the risk discussions when we talk about decision making. The third area is facilitating the making of near-term tough decisions, right? So we talked about this a little bit before. We know that 2050 seems far away, but it's not. What can we do in this process to really help you all make the decisions that you need to make? And then also not make you make all the decisions. If those can be made later, let's identify them. And also what would be the drivers and timing of future decisions so you can come back to them later. Creating an adaptive, dynamic, feasible implementation pathway. One of those aspects of that is identifying and developing strategies that align with funding opportunities. So that's somewhat covered in one of the evaluation criteria when we didn't just stop at unit cost. We also looked at the potential for funding of the strategy and evaluating it as such. Whatever you do decide in your preferred portfolio that you do select, we want to make sure that we understand how you're going to be able to implement that with regard to potential for funding in the future. And then we want to make sure that this planning process is encouraging and facilitating staff and board involvement. So continued involvement with all of you as well as staff, but also that we're tapping into your diverse public and making sure that we're getting potential collaborators engaged in the process as well, that also have skin in the game of what happens as part of this plan. And then again, on the education, this is an opportunity. Going through a planning process like this provides a lot of opportunity to provide education to both public and customers, not only on ACWD's current and planned management of water resources, but also, of course, then what it is that you're planning to do and how you're going to go about doing it. And then finally, we wanted to create a planning process that supports the development of related planning efforts so that it works with them. It doesn't reinvent the wheel. It benefits them, and there's consistencies between them, such as the engineering reports, upcoming urban water management plans, SGMA compliance, and rate studies.
Just a quick comment that we had talked about quantifying and doing some quantification. One was the loss of a major water supply for at least 6 months and how we would respond in the various scenarios when we lost our major water supplies for a period of time.
Go ahead.
So, we did, and we had a good discussion about, I think one of the challenges when we're doing a long range plan like this is we're really trying to focusing out what's it going to be like in 2050. And so we had a discussion about sort of intermediate outages of when you're down for 6 months or you're off a supply. And so the thought is that's going to really be taken under consideration when you do your infrastructure master planning. I think having said that, there is an element when we go and assess to previous conversation about the reliability and availability of certain supplies. We can also embed some of that risk of whether you think that there's going to be more potential for those outages to occur depending on where the source is. But I think at least with the offlining of certain supplies and having a backup of 6 months to be able to accommodate that, it's probably more the purview of the infrastructure master planning to figure out what are the strategies that you would do to offset that.
Well, it may be that we rely on our groundwater reservoir and extend the current parameters in order to achieve or we have an overabundance of water coming in from different sources.
And if I just might make a tangential comment, Director Weed, a 6-month outage suggests perhaps something catastrophic happening. And as you think about implementation, oftentimes you have to be a little bit opportunistic or at least ready to move when there's an opportunity. And I think that's one of the features of this plan is recognize there's a lot of things that kind of come and go, funding, bills, administrations that will create or reduce the opportunities. And so in that sense, the degree to which we're able to be nimble because of this plan, I think would be an important outcome. If we were to achieve all these planning objectives, would you deem this effort successful? Why or why not?
Yes, 2 thumbs up.
2 thumbs up, Director Sethy.
My concern is it's so generic that when it comes to making the actual decisions, politics comes in and warps the process.
Mhm.
What a dreary thought.
I would say yes, I will consider it successful, but it's pretty ambitious.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yes,
I am always the optimist.
it served you well, Director Sethy. Anything missing? Anything missing in these planning objectives?
One of the black swans in the water world is water quality. And it's going to hang out there. It'll be, we've got several coming down the pike, whether it's hormones, microplastics, PFAS, and others that are appearing on the horizon. And that is one that is it's one of the, maybe you can't plan for it, but it's that cloud that you have to at least recognize.
Yes. Let's see.
All right, so this is our final section. I have several slides on this because I think as we're heading into talking about outreach and engagement, that was one of the big deliverables that we had for phase 1. It's the most correlated to work that we did in phase 1 because we wanted to use this as an opportunity to figure out, let's do some testing, let's get some information about how to do outreach and engagement so that we really can have a meaningful process. And so there was a lot that came out of phase 1 that's directly feeding into this area, which is why we have a good deal of slides about some of the approaches that we're taking for phase 2 or recommending. So to summarize some of the key aspects that we really wanted to focus on in creating this phase 2 approach is interested party engagement. So we heard from the few folks that we did have, their subset of who we're hoping is going to actually end up participating in phase 2. What can we do to get your attention and get your actual participation? There's a lot of competing interests, right? And so, they were honest with us and they said, minimize the number of meetings, but don't have any virtual meetings because the people just kind of tune out and they don't really engage and participate. If we're really going to have meaningful workshops, then let's not have that. And probably the best way is to focus on specific interests. Like if we come into a meeting, we know what it's about, we can decide whether it's something that we really want to contribute on or not, instead of just having general meetings where we're having to sign up for a bunch of meetings. So that was really helpful. On the public involvement side through the survey, we asked about, what kinds of things would you be interested with regard to this planning effort? And it really was sort of like, given everything else we have going on in our world, we're really interested in milestone updates. Email was the preferred form of communication, and that, there's just really minimal interest in showing up for in-person meetings, which was great, because I think none of us really like having in-person public meetings and nobody shows up. And so it really helped us think, like, what can we do to engage them that isn't that sort of traditional format? And then, of course, the big third area is the education again. How can we use this as an opportunity to provide school curriculum, but also educate the wider community on all the things that we've just talked about today? So one of the cool tools I want to just offer up right off the bat is a virtual platform that's not a virtual meeting, but it's a virtual platform that sort of is in the spirit of meeting people where they're at and when they're ready to participate, but also doesn't do it in a vacuum. So people can see and respond and collaborate and see other people's comments. So it's a new thing that we've been seeing in sort of this sort of virtual interactive space, that you would create a website and then you would be able to have platforms where you could survey people on questions, or you could have them, give them a little assignment and they provide input. They can review documents. They can provide input on interim deliverables. People can see their comments. You can sort the comments, and it's a great way of actually making sure that you've got all of them. And it also results in sometimes more thoughtful commenting because they're not at some public meeting. They've had time to sort of digest it, and they can do it in a time and space that's convenient for them when they actually feel like thinking about this stuff. So, instead of, you'll see in the public part, we just wanted to kind of throw this out here now, instead of having in-person public meetings, which we're not convinced people will actually show up at, we're actually recommending that we move to sort of this new platform that, COVID has definitely helped accelerate a lot of these tools for community and public engagement that has been pretty successful. So
I just want to
yeah.
offer something here quickly.
Mhm.
I participated in 2 of these
Oh, really?
in the last 2 years with the city of Fremont.
Oh, yeah.
So one was for development of our new Parks and Recreation plan
Okay.
for the community and looking at various options and everything. And I found it really helpful
Oh,
because
good.
just like you're saying, I could think about things for a few days and then I could write up what I thought were helpful comments. But it was much easier to do if I thought about it for a while. I did another one on the park, pop-up areas around town. Like we
Oh,
have
yeah.
one in Mission San Jose where once a quarter, they close off all the streets and you have music and art and all kinds of food tasting and things like that, wine tasting. So in both situations, I thought it was really novel and it allowed me some freedom to really contribute.
That's great. It's great to hear firsthand account of you using that. And it's more common in the land planning spheres when we're talking about community development or urban planning. But there's definitely a lot of good applications for the type of things that we're talking about with this type of planning
Well,
effort
this
too.
this was a lot of land planning,
Mhm.
you know? What are we gonna do out at
Right.
Pacific Commons with all this property that we own? And
Mhm.
what kind of facilities do you want to see built there? What do you want to see in the current Central Park and other park facilities? New community centers?
Mhm.
There were like 100 questions, that people were feeding into.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks for that firsthand account. I'm glad that you enjoyed that process. So this is our outreach and engagement framework that we're proposing. It's got several elements in it, and I'll briefly go through each of them in the interest of time. We only have 10 minutes left, so I know we'd like to get your input on this as well. So all starts in the core team in the middle, which is the consulting team and key district staff. They're going to be responsible for the plan development. They're going to be also the entities that are compiling and analyzing all the input that they get from all the other boxes that we see here. And they will be the ones that are making recommendations to you all for decision making. And so you'll see there the relationship between the core team and the board of directors is an iterative relationship where you know, we're going to be having workshops where they're going to be presenting at interim places along the process. It's not just at the end. And there's going to be decisions that are going to be made as we go along. And so that relationship of the core team and the board of directors is going to be important continuing into the future. The extended team is going to be providing input into the core team. It can include executive staff members and subject matter experts throughout the district. We're hoping that they can provide us useful data and information so we have synergies across the departments and understand how anything that's being done in this plan impacts water resources as well as other ACWD functions. And of course, they're going to be involved in reviewing a lot of the draft deliverables that are produced. The advisory work groups, this is an area where instead of creating just like a technical advisory committee or one committee that's a bunch of people that meets regularly, this is where we took that input and we said, okay, let's just create some working groups that are, people can come. It doesn't need to be a set group of people. We can focus them around key aspects and ideas so they know if they're really interested in this, that maybe they want to come to this topic. So we'll have topical workshops that all the interested parties can come to. They'll be in person. Examples of that could be, you know, development of regional projects, some of the conversations around environmental stewardship and bringing in some other partners into those discussions, some of the discussions around equity and inclusion in the process. And so those topics are not solidified yet. That'll be some of the process as we're getting into it of where we think these work groups would be really useful. And hopefully that'll help people sort of value their time and come to things that they think would be most beneficial to the process. And then of course, that's just input. You know, they're not going to be making any decisions. They're just going to be providing input. And again, it's up to the core team to sort of decide, okay, based on what we're hearing, how can we provide recommendations and then provide them to all of you for input and decision making. Public engagement, as we talked about, they're very focused on sort of the update side of it, as well as an opportunity to provide education. So we want to build upon this initial survey. We talked about this virtual web-based engagement tool. And then it also will give us, when we get into the draft document time frame, it'll really help us catalog and organize the feedback that we get to help with the decision-making on the final version of it. And then of course on the education, and this is where we really want to leverage a lot of the great work that's already being done by ACWD staff and developing and coordinating on education and public through the public affairs group. So it responds to requests for education, leverage these programs, and you can see a few of them there. Project WET course and activities, in-school presentations, video contests, newsletter tours, climate literacy programs, and extracurricular programs. So it's really about figuring out how what we're doing can be added into existing mechanisms that are already happening. So the overall process, this is going to be happening. All of this engagement outreach is going to be happening all through our overall planning process, which starts with the goals that we have discussed here today. We move into supply and demand forecasting, water resources, options and strategies development, the compiling of those options and strategies into portfolios based on themes, assessing the performance of those portfolios based on the evaluation criteria that we just discussed here today, and then selecting a preferred portfolio and moving towards implementation, coming up with implementation strategies for that portfolio. In more detail, this is what it looks like. At this point, you can see here in this chart, it shows summer 2024. We're taking the outreach plan that we developed in phase 1, goals and objectives that we developed in phase 1, and bringing them into phase 2 as the basis for creating this web portal with the virtual tool that we talked about. And you'll see here some idea of the points at which we want to make sure we're engaging with the extended team, you know, some of our interested party to get advisory workshops, and then also subsequent meetings with you all through workshops. And that sort of tracks along a little bit more detail here on sort of the technical processes of all the things that we're going to be doing through the planning process, from future condition scenarios analysis to understanding baseline demand and supplies and deficits, the packaging and assessing of options and to portfolios, bringing in the criteria, looking at trade-off analysis. And you can see then on the bottom, some of the key deliverables that will be coming out of the process that are correlated with those steps above. All right, so that was a lot. We still have a few minutes left for discussion.
Let me comment briefly on the community engagement. If this, that extensive community involvement and outreach is only for this one report, I wonder about the cost and time involved in trying to get this message out. It's not related to a specific project. It's just general information. And so for the purposes of this report, I get the impression that my feeling is that we're doing far more in that area than need be to accomplish the results we're looking for in the report itself.
So I'll take that as a little bit of a question and try to answer some of it. So I think the strategy there was, public meetings are quite expensive actually to do. And so I think by doing this sort of platform of having a website with that sort of interactivity, I think it helps cut some costs there actually. And it actually targets people's attention and time and will save some cost on the back end of trying to, determine what all the comments were, how to work them in.
Okay.
So it'll help with that. And then also I think on the, with the education element, so a lot of those programs are already happening. It's just a matter of plugging in this content into those already existing programs.
Okay, so exactly. I think the point I was making, there was not a distinction made of what's going to be funded, what this project per se is going to do, but how are you going to interface with some of these other existing programs? And I think that'd be helpful just to, and when we get a budget, to know how much that effort is going to be. We're giving us even a more realistic look.
So you just want to ensure that all these efforts are streamlined district-wide as part of this.
Well, folks, you look for a level of focus at some point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One thing I see Kelly A is still with us. I'd just like to reach out to him and see if he has a comment. Oh, there goes his hand.
Okay, I've unmuted, so I should be here. Yeah, when you mentioned the streetscape of Commerce Drive, that is a very, very symbolic street there, a very symbolic streetscape, and symbolizes a huge political and management mistake that the city of Fremont has made, where literally one side of the street has no parking. The other side of the street has parking allowed, and the reasons for outline parking are bogus. Let's say. I won't get into the details, but this is kind of thing where government organizations will make decisions and tell you what public safety is for various reasons that have nothing that are unrealistic and also don't align with the needs of their residents of the public. So when it comes to the water supply things, people don't want to pay more for overpriced water, like what's happening in San Diego, where they put in huge projects, very expensive, and demand is not going up to use up all that new supply. They don't want more supply at any cost. And there are real risks right in the intermediate term of like groundwater banking. Are we supposed to, what are we supposed to do? Double down on that? Or are we supposed to make plans to move on from that because long term it may not be as reliable as it is right now, or it may be less reliable in the future. And and there's different kinds of water supply. Like some cities that are expanding capacity to meet peak summer demands, and those peak summer demands are actually to water their lawns. And maybe if the price of lawn watering was high enough, they would all choose not to water their lawns because they don't want to pay that high of a price for watering lawns, even though they love their lawns, but not that much, not enough to pay for them. So and that also goes to the project selection. Like I would support avoiding entanglements in costly mega projects like the regional ocean desalination that everyone knows is very expensive. But there are other kinds of desalination, the brackish that may not have such that may cost less. So maybe those are more realistic. But certainly ocean desal on cost reasons and environmental reasons is going to have a lot of opponents. Yeah, I think I've pretty much hit a lot of things. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you, Kelly.
Any other comments in the phase 2 approach? Right.
Hey,
I
well,
have one comment. I hope that when we do have a completed report at the end of this planning cycle, that appended to it or at the front cover is all of the valuable help we had from our consultants, facilitator, all of the inputs from different parties, because 10, 15, 20 years from now, it would be really valuable for people to look back and see that this was done in a very comprehensive way. It wasn't done in isolation with just a few people.
absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, that speaks to Director Weed's comments about, geez, maybe some of this part's expensive, maybe it's not necessary. It is necessary to make the effort for that for posterity. As somebody who has dug through boxes looking for the public input that shaped the policy objectives in 1995 and has never found them, I take that very close to heart.
And the value you're contributing is appreciated.
But think of all the kudos we've given ourselves for that success of that 1995 program.
Sure have, and deservedly so.
But a concern I have is that we take note of the real major risk we have with semi-tropic delta conveyance and some of the other seismic, et cetera, that we acknowledge the fact that it really is a doomsday scenario that we have to put into our overall plans.
There absolutely is. And that's really the heart of all of this is quantifying that risk and figuring out, as I put it, how much life insurance do you want to buy? How much homeowners insurance do you want to buy? You can get a really great policy for $30,000 a year, but is it really worth it? It's the same questions we're going to have with all of this is, how much risk do we want to assume about future uncertainties of our existing supplies, and how much do we want to shore those up with new investments or other alternatives, water supply strategies, non-water related strategies that can help mitigate risks? There's many roads to Rome, and quantifying risk and our appetite for risk is going to, it's the very beginning. It's the very beginning. We haven't even talked about things like, what is going to be our level of service goal? What does reliability mean? You want 100%? You want 80%, 90% in a drought? That'll come in phase 2.
We want fire flows and sanitary flows. We'll let the county take care of the potable water.
After the earthquake. I know what you're referring to. Not on a day-to-day basis, right? Right. Well, that concludes the core content of this evening's presentation. We'll preview next steps. I think we're going to step back and digest everything that was heard tonight. I have a general sense, though, that as we went through it, we had a fair amount of support for and approval for the recommended major things, which are those goals and objectives for the program. We are missing one of your colleagues tonight, and I'm going to be speaking with council shortly after this as to how we can receive Director Akbari's input on this material. We we have a few options here. The project team is finalizing the scope of work for proposal for phase 2, and we have to go to bid for that. Will be the completion of phase 1 as a standalone project. But before we do that, I have a feeling we're going to be coming back to this board in its complete assemblage, maybe for a nod. We're going to have to reconvene and figure out what that transition is to completion, given that it is important to have the unanimous support of this board before we proceed. Not to mention the board member not here has probably got the most runway in front of him to be implementing this project if he were to be staying on the board. So we'll probably either at a committee or next month's board meeting finalize the recommendation for next step on this. But it sounds like we're mostly there, what we heard tonight. Ms. Heidiss, any thoughts to share on that?
No, I think you summed it up well. This was really helpful feedback to hear today, and we really appreciate everybody's effort and hard thinking. And I know some studied ahead, and I think it was well worth the effort. I know staff's been working really hard with the consultant team on this as well, which I very much appreciate. And we will look forward to coming back with some follow-up.
I think one point that maybe we didn't emphasize was that the information presented here tonight in terms of setting those goals, objectives, and criteria, and the lists of things to consider are not final. These are recommended, and I think the plan would be we would, at the very first, at the outset of phase 2, actually formalize that with sort of a board action of some form, so that there's still some flexibility on these things that you heard tonight.
Okay. I think that's all we're gonna do then, correct? I would like to thank everybody and all the efforts that went into this. Yes, it's global, but it's important. It's important, and I think your efforts are all appreciated.
Thank you.
Yeah, what we heard, this active engagement is fantastic. You start a planning process. You want to start with the universe, right? And then whittle it down, figure out what matters and whittle it down. And I think that's exactly what we've achieved tonight. Okay. Right.
Yeah, thanks very much, everybody. It's been an interesting evening. I'm sure the interesting stuff is going to get even more interesting going forward. Looking forward to that. The sparks will really fly later. But in the meantime, I have one short general manager's report, item 5.1. We do have director's comments too on the agenda. So just quickly on the general manager's report, I just wanted to give the board a bit of a heads up in terms of how we're going to deal with the loss of our director of operations and maintenance, Mr. Aarons. And we're already feeling it today. This of course is Mr. Aaron's last meeting. Tomorrow is his very last day. So we've got some very large shoes to fill. I just want to give the board a heads up as to the approach here. So we're in the middle of inside-outside recruitment, very broad recruitment, making very good progress on that. But of course, we'll need to have some coverage between now and when that position is filled on a permanent basis. So in order to provide for that sort of interim coverage, I tossed the ring out and asked people to toss their hat into the ring if they were interested in the pain and suffering that goes along with trying to provide coverage there. And of course, we have just outstanding people here who expressed their interest in helping out. And I gotta just express my appreciation for that and for those folks who did that. From that process, I've have a number of folks that you should expect to see over the coming months. And I just want to give you a quick preview. Starting at 5:01 p.m. tomorrow, our first interim director of operations and maintenance will be Mike Wickham, our water production manager, who was here but I think he's since moved on. But you'll see, I think anyway, you'll see Mr. Wickham for all of May. And then all of June, you will see Dan Stevenson, no relation, who is our facilities maintenance manager, who will be covering all of June. And then all of July, the current plan is, depending on how long the recruitment goes and so forth, you would expect to see Bob Marshak, who's our facilities engineering supervisor. And then if the recruitment continues to go on, I just not very decisive or something isn't working super efficiently, then we would expect to see Jacob Reed, who's our emergency services and security officer. So it'll be a little bit chaotic because there'll be multiple transitions and so forth. Overall, this, in my view, serves to kind of spread the load a little bit, spread the love a little bit, and also give a number of folks a little bit more perspective about the role and so forth. So my apologies for the back and forth and different people you'll see. But I'm so grateful that we have great people that stepped up to help out in that role. And I'm also so grateful for Mr. Ahrens and his service to this organization. You know, it's only been about 5 years, but this fella has brought so much value to this organization. He's been a big player in water in the Bay Area, as you know, and in California. He's brought us a lot of insight, a lot of perspective, a lot of capability, and he's brought me a great advisor, a great counselor, and somebody who's not afraid to say, you're absolutely wrong. And I very much have valued Kurt's input. He's a great member of our executive team, and he's done so much in this organization to truly break down silos and inject real authentic collaboration between our departments. Again, big shoes to fill, but I just got to express my appreciation. Once again, Kurt, sorry, on your very last opportunity to have this recorded forever in public.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Happy retirement, Kurt. Okay, that completes my general manager's report.
Okay, we have a few director comments. Dave?
I'll try to be quick here on two of my reports. The Los Vaqueros Reservoir meeting, which I attended with Mr. Wunderlich is my alternate. I'm just going to highlight a few things. First, we have a rotation. We have an 8-member board with rotation occurring right now among 3 board members. So Director Eisenberg from Valley Water District was replaced by Director Varela, whom we all know. Director Ellen Weir, our secretary of our board, was replaced by the general manager of her district because she's moving into private practice, but will still be representing grasslands. And the chair of our board, Angela Ramirez Holmes, did not run for re-election to the Zone 7 board and is moving out of state. So her last meeting will be May 3rd, and then we will select a new chair. Number 2, we gave our executive director her performance review in closed door session. I have the report that she wrote for our board if you want to read it, and the board package here. I'll leave it with Mr. Stevenson. And we gave her essentially an A+ and exceeded expectations in most areas. We did have a number of areas. We put together 5 goals for the next year for her. One of which I think I can disclose, the other 4 are more confidential, but one is just to have greater outreach to each one of the member agencies and to give planned board presentations, because it seems to be more isolated rather than the whole board of every district hearing. I also want to bring up something that I brought up in the meeting. the costs are going up on the project. We're above 1.5 billion and getting close to 1.6. But I will say, in representing this district, I was a little perturbed that all of a sudden 2 new projects were put into the project schedule. Backup power improvements at Old River and Middle River for the benefit of CCWD. And and 2 different water treatment plant upgrades. This is all part of the pumping plant 1 replacement project. So I had to ask the question, who is paying for this extra $33 million in 2 projects? And I asked whether it's since mostly to the benefit of CCWD, are they paying for it, or is the JPA paying for it? The program manager, Hallmark, said that it had yet to be negotiated or determined. And the one of the assistant general managers for CCWD was sitting in the back of the room, and I could tell that he was not pleased with my questions. So I'm hoping that we will learn some more there. Otherwise, I heard a great line from a trial today about standard operating procedures. So everything was going otherwise according to standard operating procedures. Second report is on the tour of the South Bay Aqueduct. Sorry, I didn't bring my map, but I gave the map to Mr. Stevenson. That was a thoroughly enjoyable tour. Best boots on the ground tour I've had of the South Bay Aqueduct. And John and I got to go back in time to 1962 when the district had a turnout out of ultimate paths that still could be used today. We had a breakage in the conveyance system. It was really cool to visit. I was surprised that after 60 years or more, what the integrity of the canal was. I thought I would see more subsidence in different areas, but I didn't notice that. Water was flowing at 50 CFS, around 100 acre feet a day. Yeah, it was a pretty good tour all the way through the Livermore Valley. And I'm happy we went on the tour because we were talking with quite a few other folks from around Livermore, Pleasanton. It's good. And it was free.
I'll follow up on that letter on this.
I didn't really have to give a report.
First, the tour was organized by Dick Quigley, who serves on the Alameda County Agricultural Advisory Committee, and he is the chair of the Trails Subcommittee. The great majority of the members on this tour, there are only less than 20, about 20, were from the Tri-City Conservancy. The push is to develop a trail utilizing top of bank and right of way to the South Bay Aqueduct from Livermore to Milpitas, which would come through our district and through some neighborhoods in the Warm Springs area in particular. So that has a potential major impact on within our service area, should that be implemented. In conjunction with that, Fremont just authorized a number of homes just to the north of Ohlone College, where the backyards are the South Bay Aqueduct, which are fenced off, but they gave them credit for space based 3 feet to their fence, and then the rest, how they get across the fence to the other little portion of the property on the other side of the right of way was left unanswered. And putting a trail through that area was not in the staff discussion or reports. It's coming down the pike, and right of ways next will be Hetch Hetchy and other maybe ACWD's right of ways if there's no development in the area. So the trail community is looking at that is an opportunity and even a mandate.
Can I add to that real quick?
Oh, yeah.
Our tour guides were two gentlemen from DWR that work out of the field office near Byron. And so one of the benefits of going on the tour, which didn't quite expect, was the interaction with both of them on all the issues that are affecting what they're managing and how they manage it and how they're looking at the future of repairs that need to be made, different facilities that need to be replaced as far as pumping water and everything else, distributing water. Very interesting just to spend, all that time with two very knowledgeable people.
All right. A question which I was not able to ask, but it intrigues me, was the complete absence of vegetation on the banks of the open channel. How they achieve that would be of interest. So it is our drinking water supply.
Well, I did ask the question after Director Weed raised it. So they said they use an herbicide and they use it in such a manner that it the exposure to the water flowing in the creek is minimized. Really tried to downplay any chemicals ending up in the water. But yeah, Director Weed is right. There was not a weed to be seen.
I felt alone. I felt slighted. Okay. Then I did attend the legislative symposium of Aqua. It was an afternoon meeting, opportunity to meet and interface with a number of people. Dr. John Coleman and the Calaveras group that he is now part of now that he's left East Bay Mud. So, thank you.
Don't believe we have anything else on the agenda this evening,
Adjournment.
other than adjournment. Wrong agenda. I was on that earlier. Well, with that, I'm going to declare the meeting over.
Yay.
Sure. Right. 6:23. Thank you, everybody.